Hello and welcome to a further session in our series, The Dark Side of AI. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Randy Deutsch, who has been a distinguished guest with us before, back by popular demand. I noticed on our poster here we have done his name wrong. My apologies there. Randy, I will introduce Randy in a moment. What we're hoping to do today is just broadly to have a kind of fireside chat, which is trying to look at the positive side of AI. Let me just simply say briefly about the poster here. I don't know if you recognize this, but it is something that's kind of become quite popular back in the UK. A poster that was developed in 1939 for the British public with the threat of war, the Second World War, about to, well, it did obviously happen. The poster actually was the idea was that it was an expression of British stiff upper lip, where we would not get too concerned despite the war that was going the war that was about to happen. In fact, the poster was not displayed very often, but around year 2000, it became someone discovered it and it became this kind of cult object. You might also be aware of in the title, Don't Panic. Again, perhaps a British reference. Anyone who's read the book or seen the movie, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was written by Douglas Adams, one of my compatriots, also from the University of Cambridge, was a cult book at the time. It does, in some senses, touch on the theme of AI because it does have a supercomputer in that story that takes 10 million years to try and calculate the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And of course, as we all know, the answer is 42, which then led to some scratching of heads, and they then decided to go and build another supercomputer to find out what was the question in the first place. Elon Musk thinks of this as a book about philosophy. To get the right answer, you have to first of all ask the right question. In the context of ChatGPT, what alarms me is that we could probably get a similar answer from ChatGPT, and except it wouldn't take 10 million years; it would just take 3 seconds. Anyway, this is part of a series that actually proved less about the dark side and possibly on occasion more about the positive side of things. But there are some very, very good sessions that we've uploaded to our Digital Futures YouTube library, including, I would say, an outstanding session on AI and copyright, where we invited 2 intellectual property lawyers, one from Harvard and one from MIT Media Lab. And I think there's a very informed discussion about what is a very important debate in that series. And this goes right on the back of a session that we had a couple of weeks ago, where we invited Eric, who was, I think, one of the I would say a disaster theorist, a kind of professors of disaster kind of thing, who applied his thinking about disaster theory to the context of AI and came up with, I think, a very scary scenario. Now, in order to counterbalance that, we are going to bring in Randy. And I would say that whenever I give a talk on these things, I always try to end on an optimistic note and to show this particular poster on occasions, because I don't think that we should panic too much. Now, just to say briefly, Randy is, as I mentioned, been with us before. Randy combines his time between being an associate clinical professor at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, with working in practice, and particularly on a couple of think tanks working on AI, plus being a prolific author. And his most recent book is Adapt as an Architect, a Mid-Career Companion. His other books include Convergence, The Redesign of Design, which is an AD that came out in 2017. And the book that I use a lot, Super Users, Design Technology Specialists and the Future of Practice, that came out in 2019. Randy, welcome. It's great to see you today. Maybe I could just ask you to probably embellish that little brief description with some comments on your particular focus on the world of AI that you're preoccupied with right now.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, and thank you again for having me back. A wonderful thing that you offer to everybody with your presentations, your speaking, and your big heart. Yeah, so I spend a lot of time teaching, which I love, 22 years of teaching, but I'm not a lifelong academic. I come from practice, started about 40 years ago. And today I do spend a lot of time both mentoring emerging professionals as well as recent and current students, but as importantly, involved with a number of initiatives, a Built Environment Futures Council that I started with Matt Crissell, an architect on the East Coast of the United States. The other futures councils associated with universities like University of Arizona, Design Futures Council, but also a AI Institute for Design and Construction that we are trying to get off the ground, working with a number of universities, including UCLA. And it's something that where most of what I do looks at the very positive side. I'm just not as a caveat. I'm very optimistic and positive in general. It's part of the reason I entered the field where you get to work with and play with the built environment. I think you have to be positive to do that. These are ways working with AI in a very positive way, working with others collaboratively. They were able to get a running start on moving the ball forward for our field.
So maybe, and maybe I should also say there is a further connection with AI, and that Randy, your daughter and brother-in-law are based in Manchester, and let's not forget that Manchester, I think it was called Manchester Victorian University, was I think the first university where Alan Turing had an academic post. But maybe I could just lay out the opposition, as it were, or as a background, as a foil to our discussion, and just talk about some of the concerns that we want to respond to today. And I say we because I very much also share that optimism about the future, and about the theme of adaptation and how it'll be quite all right. But just to kind of like to lay it out so that we know what we're talking about. This was an article that came out recently referring to this last week, I think it was, came out referring to, actually it was a report from MIT, but it lists out some of the kind of the statements that people, or the research that's beginning to emerge out of the field, looking at the impact on the labor market in particular of AI. Goldman Sachs report that 25%, this is overall, of the entire labor market could be automated. McKinsey saying that half of all work will be driven by AI by 2055. A UPenn and NYU and Princeton survey finds that ChatGPT alone could have an impact on 80% of the jobs, and so on and so on and so on. We kind of get the picture, and of course these are not referring to architecture as such. They're more general, but I would say that in that in that report, the Goldman Sachs report, and here you can see the 25% of all industries, the impact. We find that architecture engineering in this survey is quite high, and this actually goes against some of the earlier research that was done at the University of Oxford, where they thought the creative fields were actually fairly immune from the impact of AI. But this is one I think there's also, which is a bit of a crude diagram, but actually quite an important piece of research that came out from Harvard and MIT, which is basically looking at the impact of using ChatGPT. Now, it was done on a consulting firm. It was done by sociologists using sociological methodology. So I think it was fairly thorough in terms of its method. And what they found, which is quite remarkable, is that there is a significant improvement in the quality of the work that is being produced by those who use AI compared to those who don't use AI. I think it's 40%, which means in some senses that nobody can really afford not to use AI. There was also, as part of that same survey, a calculation of how much more you could achieve, which I think was about 30% more in terms of volume. Of course, this is all very, in a sense, vague, because we're dealing with task-specific areas, and some areas obviously require far more human intervention. Others, to some extent, we could say, let's say rendering, have been largely automated already. But nonetheless, these are some of the statistics that are beginning to come out, and we haven't seen any real focused one on architecture. To my mind, we won't be able to see that either until we actually have the software that is coming out in about 2 to 3 years' time that will effectively change the pipeline in terms of the production of design and so on. But I think all I would say is there is some degree of alarm, shall we say, that is out there by some people. So, I mean, today, I mean, I would like to, let me just stop sharing my screen so we can have a more broader conversation. But I think what I would just simply say is that, we've had all these kind of warnings. If we go back in history, particularly the movies, from Metropolis through to 2001: A Space Odyssey, to Blade Runner, and so on and so on. There's a whole series of kind of a dystopian movies that kind of predict a future in which there will be a threat from technology. And of course, now we have AI, which is proving to be so incredibly effective. ChatGPT, we are told, knows 10,000 times more than any one individual. Now we're in this situation. This kind of is coming back. I would simply say that we haven't, on the positive side, none of these predictions from the movies have proved to be true. And I'd also say that my publishers tell me that actually death sells. Anything that is a little bit scary sells in the market. And you could see that maybe to exaggerate a story would nonetheless make a kind of horror movie scenario, shall we say. But anyway, Randy, I thought, you're an incredibly positive person and optimistic and so on. So maybe we could just kick off from there about how you would kind of in general terms respond to that dystopian, bleak outlook that is portrayed in some reports.
Yeah, and perpetuated, in the media and through books with the word death in the title and so on. Yeah, so one approach that I would recommend for anybody who's listening into this is to, without being entitled or feeling as though you're entitled in some way, to assure yourself that you represent the exception to those generalizations. We've had generalizations from the very beginning. Whenever you first thought of entering the field of architecture, engineering, construction, or anything related to that, there have always been concerns, financial concerns, and ones having to do with society and also technology from the very beginning. And most of them have not come true. In this case, there are some real legitimate threats with AI, except in one case, and that is where we work with it. As the diagram just showed a moment ago, if you want to move on in your career and ignore AI, somebody working with AI, it's a cliche already at this point, represents the architect or the somebody who you will lose work to. So find ways to use it. So in preparation for the talk with Neil, when I received the invitation to speak with you, I use AI all day long, and I just asked ChatGPT 3.5 what percentage of pronouncements that you have made in writing and in your videos would be conceived as positive versus negative. And while I think a lot of the imagery, whether it is skeletons or robots or flames in the distance, and some of these titles with the word dark or death or apocalypse associated with it, actually GBT, Neil, sees you as twice as positive as you are negative, twice. So in some ways, it's not even a real story. This could be a love fest. You and I, for 3 years now, I've been using your book, Architecture in the Age of AI, a fantastic book. And I know there's a later version coming out very soon. I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. Thumbing through it, the vast majority of that is even positive. And you hit on all the things that I would want to touch on today in terms of we can't fight AI. We can't turn our backs and ignore it. You say yourself, we need to augment ourselves with it. So I think we're all really on the same page. Now, that said, maybe my books have, fewer readers because I don't use death in the title, for example. I actually have never used the word architecture in the title. I use design more generally. which is a way to hedge and maybe appeal to more people, but at the same time, design is something that's going to go on forever. But architecture, we're not so sure. In capsule, I would say we need to be on the side of AI, find ways to use it. Look at the habits that we currently have. If you're using Google all day long as your search engine, find ways to have conversations with any tool that's out there that purports to be an AI tool. Find ways with prompt crafting or prompt engineering to fine tune the results. Ask for an executive summary. If you have a long text, drop it in there for the paid version, and you can then have your own personalized version of AI that you work with. But we all need to get in this habit. It's a fantastic way to start to anticipate what's going to be discussed and said.
Randy, just one point for the audience, and maybe just to make clear, I was working on one book for Bloomsbury, my first book, and halfway through the first year of research, I came back to Bloomsbury and said, "Well, I feel a bit like Elon Musk here. I'm working with something unbelievable. It's going to make an incredible contribution, no question about that. But it's also a little bit terrifying." So I persuaded them to divide it into two separate books. The white book, which is the positive one, like The Angel, which has come out and is now about to be a second edition, updated for ChatGPT and Midjourney one, and so on. And then there's the dark book, which is the kind of black side, big Black Mirror side of things. And I obviously haven't written that second one. All I would say is that that it's actually not going to be about. I don't think that there's anything intrinsically evil at all about AI. It's just simply a tool and depends on who uses it and for what. But it is scarily good. I mean, and I get terrified every day by how amazing it is. I mean, I'm just blown away by it. And I think that what I think is, and I always think it in terms of a yin yang sign. You know, if you know the Korean flag with this yin yang and white and black circle with this, and on two sides of the yin yang, the black has some white and the white has some black. And so the white side, the black in it, has some black already in it, as it were. So the positive side has, in some senses, the slightly disturbing message. It's not because it's evil, but rather that it is so terrifyingly good, and that's the danger. And I would simply say that those who, I don't want to dwell on this at all because I want to move on from that, but those who sort of say to me, no, it's not going to take any jobs away, it's just going to be an assistant. I keep saying, well, that is precisely the problem, because you can do so much more with using AI than you can without. And we don't know exactly what that figure is, but all I would say is that my colleague here in LA, Guvench Ozil, he teaches at UCLA, and maybe part of your AI collaboration. He has I think a 4-person practice using AI, and they're winning massive competitions. So the problem is ultimately is that there's only so much work to go around, and there's only so many fees to go around, because there are a percentage of those work that.
Sure. So hold that thought for a second, only because I want to say, as a professional architect, engineer, or contractor, the world expects us to be skeptical to some extent. If we're Pollyanna-ish, if we're overly optimistic, there is some concern, just from a consumer standpoint, that maybe we haven't looked at objections, maybe we haven't looked at the dark side, the possibility that a building can fall down or a roof can leak, and so on. And so I think we actually have to bill ourselves or put ourselves forward to some extent as looking at both sides. I love the yin yang analogy. I think that's perfectly appropriate. But I also want to say, given you're in California, in Hollywood, if anyone were to write a movie or publish a novel about a happy couple or a happy family, most publishers or movie producers would not fund it. It's not really what people are interested in. We tend to want to solve our problems. We want to look at the negativity. It's not to say that people are inherently negative, but needless to say, as human beings, right, we're much more likely, back in the day, to climb trees and worry about being attacked. And I think we still have that in us. So this idea of skepticism, this idea of looking at both sides, I think is incredibly important. Lastly, I'd say, just in terms of sales, right? We're selling our books, we're selling our ideas, if we're academics and so on. Salespeople are much more successful when they're not hitting people over the head with all the benefits of their product, but when they're actually putting themselves in the shoes and the position of those that they are talking to, and they see where they're coming from and they see what their concerns are. So without trying to talk at a meta level here, I think it's all understood that we need to see both sides.
Yeah, I mean, but then picking up on the Hollywood thing again, because there was that incident a few months ago, well, not certainly, maybe a few weeks ago, where the script writers and the actors came out, and I think they could see potentially the writing on the wall that there was some kind of threat, and they wanted to really to try and safeguard their future. I haven't seen this in architecture as yet, but I've seen it in I think architects are almost universally optimistic, and charmingly so, of course. But they could see that, and understandably. And I think what I would just simply say, the message of that was, again, not that AI was responsible, but people using AI could potentially use it in a negative way. And there was this case I've mentioned before of in LA where a startup, they got rid of their copywriter because they found that ChatGPT could do it much more quickly and cheaply, of course. And so it wasn't AI who kicked that person out; it was the CEO. So I think that, I mean, in a sense, I think not only I think do clients, and I think clients actually expecting. I don't know if you've come across this, but clients increasingly are expecting architects to actually use AI in.
So to that, I would just respond. In my experience, talking to clients all over the world over time, they do not care what tools architects use. So yeah, I'll take a completely different stand on this. Not to say that you haven't heard what you've heard or seen what you've seen, but generally I would say we're having worked with clients for 40 years and talking to many who plan on working with AEC individuals and companies, that they don't want the liability of telling a design professional or construction professional what to do. They just want to make sure they get the results that they're looking for, or the design intent carries through. This, as an analogy, just goes right back to Revit, right? We thought, using BIM tools, whether ArchiCAD or MicroStation or Vectorworks or Revit, we thought at one time we can offer that as an upgrade to our clients in exchange for more precision, more accuracy, more speed, if we automate some things, and maybe even more fee. And owners caught on pretty quickly that they didn't really care what we worked with. And so that whole storyline went away. I think it's true with AI. I think there's the expectation that professionals, including design professionals, will work with AI, but not a demand. I'm not seeing that, and I'm going to look for it more.
No, I got some slightly different feedback, and I certainly found that some architects were marketing themselves in Australia, were marketing themselves, saying we're using this, and that's why I think in my book, I don't know if it was in the first edition, but I kind of predict that I think in the end architects will see AI a bit like sustainability. I am more concerned about the environment. I'm using these tools to guarantee you're going to get the best
But I
investment.
think that's a perfect example that architects today no longer say that they're involved with sustainability. In 2013, which was over a decade ago, the American Institute of Architects, AI National, actually made it a requirement that you had continuing education as an architect in North America, if not the world, in sustainability. And in 2014, 1 year later, removed that requirement because they were convinced it was just the air you breathe and the water you drink. It should not be stigmatized as a separate thing. I think it's fine that architects say they use AI, but I also think that's going to go away. It's just going to be a given that that's what we do. If you are a surviving architect, it's a given you're using AI.
Yeah, I know. I think that the idea of adaptation that lies behind what you're saying, I think is I've always thought that it's very significant. And I think that the way that we just look at the way we use language, I mean, I think that in terms of kind of CAD, and I was a student when they were producing, CAD was coming out, and we would refer to these things as CAD drawings. And now, of course, they're just drawings. But what is interesting is that what we called drawings before, which were hand drawings, now you labeled them as hand drawings. And I think that, to my mind, that kind of adaptation, absorption of things is fascinating. I mean, I did a book called Camouflage some time back, looking at the question of adaptation. I do think that's fascinating. What I didn't address was the kind of the neuroscientific insight into how the brain is plastic, and that's how we absorb these tools and come to work through them, which is more the kind of work that Andy Clark is doing. But adaptation, I think, is something that that is at the heart of it all, and that's in some ways why I'm so positive. We will adjust. We will adjust, no question. Certainly in terms of our mental framework, and also I would say on top of that, there's also to some extent, and we were kind of in this kind of world in which we're bombarded by social media the whole time. Um, what Baudrillard would call the ecstasy of communication, so much information out there. But that also leads to a certain sort of lack of cultural depth or an amnesia. There is so much happening, you kind of forget things. And one of the things I would say is that we do forget. We do forget things, how we used to do things. We move on and really don't notice or care. I think the one thing I would say is that for example, there was a time when we used fax machines, and it wasn't that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've completely forgotten about it, and we've got this new world in which we can't even imagine what it would be like to not have our cell phone around anymore. We totally depend upon it. Life has moved on, and that, in some senses, I think, is how AI is going to be there. It's not going to be so much a question of architecture and AI, but architecture in the end. It's the AI bit is going to become invisible because it becomes our kind of background horizon of consciousness.
I could not agree more. I absolutely think that's the case. I also think having conversations and inquiries with any AI tool is really valuable because of our amnesia, but also our blindness and insight. The fact that we are blind to things, whether it's fax machines or whatever it happens to be. I think one of the real values of having conversations with AI is they do point out the higher level things we may not be thinking about, the things that connect the dots, and sometimes the minutia. We as design professionals, I think, have a superpower where we're able to zoom in and zoom out. But yes, I agree, there's too much information in the world. And it's helpful to have an assistant. We can kind of relax a little bit more knowing that it's going to give us the full gestalt, and we can just review what is spit out by AI and then plug in what it is we want to think about, what we want to design, what we want to say when espousing our ideas. The other thing I want to add to adaptability, I absolutely agree that when we hear pronouncements about the AI apocalypse and how we're going to lose all these jobs, I think it's a little bit irrational, because if you actually look very carefully at the statements that are made, whether AI is going to take over strategic thinking of architects, whether it's going to do energy analysis or other forms of analysis, all of that may be true. But when you look at what the architect does, it may be dozens, if not hundreds of different things, many of which are very valuable to owners, and not to mention users, neighbors, the lay public, as well as future generations, which AI isn't addressing any of those currently. But I want to say adaptability is incredibly important, but I would be remiss in not emphasizing two other attributes of the design professional, and that is creativity. The fact that you can have hope in the human being moving forward, not only that they'll adapt to this tool, but they'll continue to find incredibly creative ways to work. But related to adaptability and creativity is this word agency. We're humans, and we're able to, it's why I say it's not about entitlement, but seeing yourself as an exception. Everybody from a marketing standpoint can find a stance or a way to position themselves in relation to the tool, whether they claim to be using it in their work or whether it's just behind the scenes that they're using it in their work. We have agency as humans. And for that reason alone, when you look at the works of designers, human designers, whether it's Pierre Charon with the Maison de Verre, I had a student who discovered it this week for the first time, and you see the jaw-dropping response that I had over 40 years ago when I first saw it. But even Brooks Scarpa, the architecture firm, or Morphosis, or Kuhimabao, who you represent in many of your books. I think all of these firms represent human agency in their work, and gives you hope that humans can create works that cannot be replicated by machines. If anything, they can just adapt their designs in ways that will benefit more people.
Maybe to go back to the first point that you used about this idea of this kind of tool that is a kind of prosthesis, shall we say? And I don't know, your term super users, it kind of, I don't know whether Elon Musk had read your book, but I mean he comes up with this idea that we are all superhuman because we have this, we are empowered by our cell phones and so on. We can do all these things, and to my mind, this is the area which I want to believe in the sense of how we can use these tools and inventively. But it becomes the one that you really can't predict. I mean, in the sense that if for Elon Musk, it's our phones that make this kind of, particularly our computers, become this extension. And well, we know from history what had happened how the mobile phone, the cell phone first came about. This idea that it was for these kind of rich businessmen. That was the initial assumption. Of course, that all changed when it became a social tool that everyone was going to use. It was, I always meant to say that it's when the rich businessman says to his daughter, give me a call and I'll come and pick you up. All those years ago, that's when suddenly you shift into another area, and you can't predict that. You can predict the tool and you know what the tool's going to do, but you don't know the inventive ways in which people are using this tool. And of course, we've seen this already with AI. We've got all these incredible, we have them on Digital Futures, some of these super talented individuals all over the world who are kind of coming on and saying, well, I'm using that plus that. And all of a sudden there is this incredible zone of invention, but that you can't predict that. And all I would say is that we are bound to see some new forms of practice or practices emerging, but by their very definition, we cannot predict that.
Right. So last week, there was a white paper that came out by a number of academics, and it had to do with law, in that ChatGPT could actually do a search of prior case studies 98.5% faster than attorneys can. And it was basically end game, not for lawyers, not for litigators, but for, looking up prior cases that use similar words. So there's going to be a want and a need for that capability. There's going to be owners or clients who want to bypass the human involvement, the annoying parts of working with human beings, the moods they'll be in, the unpredictability, and so on. I like Robin Hanson, the professor at George Mason University, the Mercatus Center, his book, The Age of M. It's not the book that I like. I like the idea that he puts forward there, which is basically that the AIs will replicate everything that professionals will do. And through regulation or just, the way the world works, there are going to be a lot of people who want to work with them, right? So we've all seen the statistic that architects are responsible for 2 to 3% of all buildings. I think in a recent comment in Digital Futures, I'm pretty sure somebody commented along those lines as well. And so that's, nobody knows exactly what the percentage is, but it's a tiny percentage that architects are responsible for. And there are going to continue to be people who want to work around design professionals. But I also think there's going to be a lot of people who want to work with design professionals, and it would behoove us to work on our people skills, to actually make that engagement so much better than working with an AI and having it spit out a result any time and attention that we put into the things I've put forward in a book like Super Users, or that you've talked about before, is going to be incredibly important. So again, just to be really clear, Super Users is primarily about the mindsets, the attitudes, the very human skills, coupled with recognizing, whether it's computational skills or AI skills, that these are things that we're going to need to work with. But it is about becoming better, more engaged human beings, better communicators, better collaborators.
Maybe I could just open up that question about how you see the role of AI kind of permeating the office ethos in some senses. I mean, I think in some senses the real blind spot we have at the moment about AI is thinking it's just Mid-Journey, DALL-E, and all these kind of things. And in much as I'm amazed by this, and I'm really impressed by the work of someone like Daniel Bolojan, who's been working with Corp generating all this material, and of course I'm blown away by the kind of the office at HA, Zahidid Architects, and but what was interesting to my mind in more my recent research is that there is also a different approach, which is the one that Foster and partners take. But they're not concerned about that. They're concerned about this as a way of sort of augmenting the workflow, of using surrogate models and other procedures that speed up the workforce, the process itself. And in some ways, it strikes me that maybe the future of AI is not so sexy. It's not about these kind of amazing creations, but rather about a way of kind of facilitating the workflow in the office. Is that something that you come across in your research?
Absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you just said. So while we're all like, nobody should underestimate whether it's hallucinating or not, the imagery that can come out of these text to image tools. They're really fabulous. That said, I very strongly I work with and I engage with daily people who also believe this as well. There are a number of things as design professionals we already do really well. And to me, it's almost embarrassing on LinkedIn and other social media means where architects and designers are posting these images of things that we already did really, really well. Yes, maybe it's slightly more imaginary, or it's it's another representation of combinatory creativity. Who knew we can do multifamily housing with a redwood forest and bring those two things together? It wasn't a question we ever asked before, but now that we're asking it, it is very cool to see that in a fraction of a second, we can have thousands of images along those lines. Now, that said, it's not a weak spot that we've ever had. Nobody's ever complained that architects don't have enough ideas and so on. So to the extent that AI can, yes, absolutely help us with our workflows, make sure that we don't have a drop off of data between the different stages that we use, is fantastic. But let's just look really honestly day in, day out. So with our students, we have mental health issues. To the extent that they can leverage AI instead of worrying about governance and copying, where I'm not talking about plagiarism per se, but where they're using imagery that's already out there. Many of our students have already done that. And, my own generation did that as well. Looked at the images of other people and used it as a starting point for their own designs. As long as it transforms, I don't see there being a downside to that, whether it's generated from AI or it's from a book or from Architizer, ArcDaily, or Google Images. It doesn't really matter. It's a starting point. We all have a lot of anxiety because design is very subjective. And so we need to find a way to start. And so I give my students a buy when they use AI that way. That said, emerging professionals and design professionals beyond mental health, they want work-life balance. They're inundated with all the demands of the world. So to the extent that AI can actually fill in the low-hanging fruit of repetitive work or drudgery, as Andrew Human so perfectly described what we should be automating, I think that there's a benefit right there. So yeah, we can talk in general pronouncements about helping our workflows, but I think we have real problems as human beings, as design professionals, as students, that all can be not only addressed, but solved by AI, whether it's free or $20 a month, whichever version you choose to use. I think the answers are already there, and shame on us for ignoring them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the trouble is about the images generation. I mean, the reason why I try and use this whole time is to try and understand the tool and the affordances of the tool and the process itself and see its limitations and so on. But of course, you could just judge it on the final output and say you end up in a very kind of superficial world of images. But I think it's really about how the processes operate. And actually, I personally, kind of as a theorist, I'm interested in how you can begin to understand how the mind works in the mirror of AI. I mean, there's a whole theoretical debate going on out there, especially the world of neuroscience, which is really opening up a new kind of interesting questions. But the thing I wanted to kind of like maybe to ask you from your huge experience of dealing both with students and also with the world of practice, is the kind of the mind of the architect itself, which I think is kind of interesting in some senses. Well, first of all, what I've discovered in terms of some of the ADs that I've guest edited, and I know that you've guest edited one as well, is that there's something that we do, or with the training we have, actually makes us quite versatile. I mean, I would say the term that Helen Castle used to use is other architectures, and I noticed that we can use that architectural imagination in all sorts of ways. I mean, there was an AD I did with Ben Asfarahi on 3D printed body architectures. I noticed that there are all these architects like Neri Oxman, all those people trained as architects like Neri Oxman, were working for Iris van Herpen and producing 3D printed fashion and so on. Equally, there's also an AD I did when I worked on the NASA projects a while back, that there are a number of architects who moved into the world of space architecture or space itself. And of course, in LA, any number of SciArc graduates are all working in the movie industry and so on and so on and so on. It's almost like there is a set of skills that we have that can be deployed elsewhere. And of course, that opens up a number of possibilities and so on. But the one thing that I wanted to kind of bounce off you in particular was there's something to my mind, and I want to see what your thoughts are about the architectural imagination. In other words, not forms, not images, but actually a way of thinking that is part of how we operate, which is in some senses a highly visual way. In the sense we diagram things, but I've often noticed, or at least I've noticed on occasions, that those trained in the visual arts can see or conceptualize complex structures and complex structures of operation that others can't. I mean, I've been in that situation with in other disciplines, and they can't see the way you can put things together, like digital futures. It's a straightforward way of operating. TED Talks were invented by architects. And also, I think, I don't know if you know the work of Manuel de Landa, who's not an architect, but he's trained as a filmmaker, but the way he conceptualizes philosophy and sees it with a certain sort of clarity, I think it maybe comes out of his visual training. And whether you see in the architectural imagination a certain inventiveness or a clarity in seeing structures of operation rather than just images and so on.
Yeah, great question. This is something at length that I addressed in a 2020 book, Think Like an Architect. It's where we don't approach problems with preconceived ideas. I don't think that this way of thinking is, I don't think architects own this capability. You have companies in California like IDEO and other design outfits that I think also approach things in a similar way, where you don't go into a problem with a preconceived idea, you have beginner's mind. But yeah, you even recognize, so I can walk in a room and after 40 years in this field as a designer, in my head, I can envision exactly the way this should be. I mean, I would go so far as to say should. And then I've got to walk backwards from that, right? Because one thing we're way too close to in our field is that we can visualize. We have that capability. We can take very complex environments with tons of information bombarding us from different directions and create a gestalt and create a vision fairly quickly. But we don't even recognize that that is a superpower that we have. We take it for granted. So to the extent that we recognize that we have something that others can't do, and I'm going to throw in here even AI. So AI, of course, can come up with an incredible image of, you give it a prompt, a written prompt, and it'll come up with an image for a high rise or whatever it happens to be. You can argue, well, it doesn't give you the back of the building. It's just showing you from one point of view. But as it gets better and you start to ask about the back of the building, it will connect the dots and create that for you. Then you can argue it doesn't have structure, it doesn't have vertical transportation within it, it hasn't met code. All these hurdles will, in short period of time, come together, as you alluded to a few moments ago. So I have no concerns that AI is going to catch up and supersede in a lot of ways. But I also think as humans, and this touches on what I was saying with adaptability, but also agency and creativity, we do have this ability to envision. And I'm not saying we should doubt it. I'm not saying we should question it. It's just something, it's another voice, and sometimes it's very legitimate. Let me use a real quick example. So there are a number of architects that use the text to image tools, as well as, of course, the LLMs as well, to arrive at a design solution that they have to admit they wouldn't holistically have come up with on their own. So they piggybacked on a lot of the thinking and a lot of the imagery. But then without a data drop off, they set that aside. And then, much like our students who are using images from the internet or wherever they happen to be getting them from, we've used that as an input, as a starting point. And now we create what's expected of us. Let's say 3 schemes for the client, the one the client wanted, and the 2 that are informed by this vision that is propped up by AI. And I'm finding again and again the AI informed or the AI inspired designs are light years ahead of what we could have just come up with in our sketchbooks or on tracing paper. And so from that alone, it already starts to hint at where we should be going as a profession and industry. We should be doing both. It's not to say that we should be tracing over AI. It's to, we should trust ourselves and this capability you're alluding to, but at the same time, know there's something much smarter than us, much faster than us that's out there. And so we should be using it.
Yeah, I had an experience, a very interesting experience the last few weeks. I was in Austria, in Kitzbühel, and the super yacht community wanted to know about AI. And I was kind of saying, well, there's something I find fascinating about the world of yachting. And that is the kind of America's Cup, the really cutting edge thing where I know they've been using AI to design these extraordinary ships. And then meanwhile, the mainstream industry is kind of conservative. It's doing things as it always has done. And I kind of said, well, I think really what we need is something that can take that know-how and technology and infuse it into this. And actually, at the end of the conference, I wish I'd known he was going to be there before. There was a guy called Simon Schofield, who was from Bar Technologies, a group in the UK, and he did a PhD in ETH on AI, naval architecture, or whatever, and then worked in the America's Cup. And they thought, okay, how do we take this and feed this into mainstream design? And they're doing all sorts of extraordinary things. They have these kind of almost sails they're putting on super tankers now that are drastically changing everything, changing increasing, reducing costs and making things far more environmentally sustainable and so on. But what he did say that was kind of interesting is that they no longer use drawings at all. They no longer use drawings. They go straight from data. So when they're designing a hull or something, it will come out of the data itself, and that I find fascinating, and a little bit alarming, I'd say. In the sense that when you're in this kind of area where you are using data and AI in a generative way, because once you can test something, you can generate something, and this is great in some senses because it's really showing us where sustainability should be. I think if we can reduce costs and things and carbon footprints, that's better than putting plants on balconies or something and symbolically being that you actually need to do that. But at the same time, it kind of it forces me to ask this kind of question. Well, how will the term design itself? I mean, maybe it won't change. I mean, maybe we'll still use the term design, but what we mean by design will incorporate all these tools into it. But at the point where I mean, it's almost like the lexicon that we use at the moment, or at least we have been using, which is a kind of top-down, we're going to make some form, and this is what it is being transposed into another arena, which is say, let's create a search and find the outcomes, and then select, edit, and whatever else will go with one of those outcomes. It's almost like we need to, I don't know, do we need to change our lexicon? Do we need to change the word design? Do we need to change the word from a design to an outcome? Do we have to radically think, or will it just be naturally incorporated into this new way of operating that we're going to have in the future?
Yeah, again, excellent question. I don't think owners and clients are going to dictate how we work. They want us to work in a way that's beneficial for everyone involved. and come in on time and under budget and so on. So in my 2017 book, Convergence, the subtitle, The Redesign of Design, was inspired by the fact that every time I do a public speaking engagement somewhere on the planet, somebody would come up to me and say to me, well, at least design isn't changing. Um, and so I actually put that in there because my 2015 book, which clearly nobody had read, Data-Driven Design and Construction, it's this idea that, and I share this with my students who are really blown away by their future if they can work this way. So imagine working in a dashboard, having your laptop open, and you have these bar charts and pie charts off to one side, and you have two competing schemes for your, high rises side by side. Some are mid rises, some are low rises, some are high rises. And you can manipulate the models. And from the corner of your eye, you see the bar charts and pie charts in terms of square footage, in terms of parking, in terms of landscape or open space, in terms of cost. All of this is changing. And so data has always informed what we do as a designer. But my argument was that we improve as designers when you work in an environment like that so much more quickly. So if you just leave an architect alone using SketchUp or hand drafting or CAD for 10 to 15 years, they'll become a really good designer ultimately, just through osmosis. It happens. But using a dashboard in that situation, your designs are not only informed immediately, but you are improving as a designer because you're seeing the effects in terms of the data in real time, to the point where in 2 to 3 to 5 years maximum, you're becoming a much better designer. And every student, I have 50 students in a seminar class, which is way too large for a seminar, called Design and Construction Futures, a final semester graduate course. All of them want to work in that environment. But where I'm going with this is this. There's architects like Scott Crawford at LMN Architects and many others out there who manipulate the data, who take those bar charts and pie charts, and when they see the budget's too high or the square footage has grown too large, or if it's a residential project and it has too many 3 bedrooms, they don't manipulate the model on the right. They manipulate the charts on the left. That's data-driven design, as far as I'm concerned. And it's an incredibly legitimate way to work. And that's been around for almost a decade. And my students want to sign up. They're like, why are we working in Revit? Why are we working in Rhino? Why didn't somebody tell us about this? And yeah, it hasn't caught on, but we will all be better. And then just, add AI to the equation, and then we'll see where this takes us. But I think the key thing here, metaphorically, is this idea that we work in this environment. I also just want to real quickly say, when you're talking about the yacht and the sails, that's a great example of combinatory creativity that AI encourages, but it's something that we've always done, and we shouldn't discount that we do, bringing two disparate things together and creating something that's even better than the first. But something that yachts and maybe even Foster Partners airplane does, any airplane does, yachts and planes, you don't pick a destination and it goes from point A to point B, right? It makes 1,000 or 1,000,000 mistakes along the way, and we adjust. And that's the adaptability, right? We constantly go off plan, right? We can't predict with those sails that there's going to be a strong wind at a certain moment, but we know the ultimate goal we're aiming for. And so we adjust along the way. I think architects, metaphorically, or as an analogy, we very much need to do the same thing. We have prevailing winds with new headlines every single day, with these negative pronouncements, and these very real concerns, whether they are intellectual property or copyright, whether they are other people eating our lunches, whether they are other things that we should be concerned about, like burnout, professional burnout, or compensation in our field. All these things are things that we should be concerned about and do represent prevailing winds that we need to adjust to. And we're capable of doing that if we see ourselves as adjusting to them and correcting our course.
Maybe, I mean, just as an aside, I want to throw in a little anecdote. I don't know if you're aware, but the strange thing is that a lot of this AI work came strangely, out of the OMA office. not an office you'd associate with the use of technology, especially. But it was precisely because when I knew her, who is now the CEO of XCool, and of course her name of XCool means X Coolhouse, used to work for XCool, used to work for Rem Koolhaas, because she was working in, I think but she first in Rotterdam, then the office in Hong Kong, where they're in Lang Kwai Fong, which is the kind of nightclub area, and they were working until gone midnight, and people were partying downstairs, and over the weekends they were working, and it was a very inefficient way of working, and you know. And she criticizes, I mean, she exactly uses the data-driven way of operating as the way we should be doing. And the way we should be doing is the sketch-driven thing, which is something that you kind of throw away and start again in a very wasteful way of thinking. So it was really, you know, she was saying, I don't want to do this again. I've got to find a solution that comes out of it. So now that was one of the motivations that led to one of the initiatives that we're part of. But I wanted to just kind of throw something out there, and that is to say, in a way, almost like the blind spot. We've spoken about the abilities of the architect, but the blind spot, in some senses, is we precisely see things in terms of aesthetics the whole time, which is amazing. You know, we can produce beautiful looking things, but it often means that we preclude other kind of forms of operation. And I think some of the data issues you talk about, or the performance-based issues, are precisely those that kind of we overlook. I mean, typically I always say that we aestheticize everything. We don't look at this, the economic and so on, particularly the economic, social, and political. But the economic thing is a blind spot. You know, we look at any book on architecture, there's no reference to cost apart from the price of the book on the back cover. And the client wants to know that, and to have some data there that is telling us what it's costing, and you're monitoring it, it seems to be an absolutely kind of essential thing. But the one thing I wanted to kind of throw out there was really that when you think about the visions of the future that architects have, especially in terms of the city, sometime back in 2009, I produced another AD called Digital Cities, and we invited lots of architects in to go and do these things. And Patrick Schumacher, that was his first, this time he mentioned parametricism, and he had this vision of the parametric city that would look like the parametric city. Of course, nothing has happened at all. It's been a very different outcome. And it strikes me that really, in some senses, the Achilles heel of the architect is to be so obsessed with form and images alone, without the kind of what is informing the form, the information in particular. And it strikes me that with AI, that is going to be the really important thing, is how information can be used not just in the design and the construction of buildings, but also in the way that buildings are monitored in terms of their performance, and indeed how cities are operating. I'm thinking here in particular kind of traffic issues, how you can use AI to solve those problems. Let me just throw that out there about how, to my mind, the future is information rather than form.
Sure. So I think it's a false separation of topics, first of all. So I think it's a cliche that architects, they run over budget, they run over schedule, they're focused on aesthetics. I think we can cherry pick a number of firms that may, especially legacy firms, that could fall into that trap. My very strong recommendation would be to recognize that's the legacy of our field. You know, I want to say for better or worse, but it was always in some ways worse, but then you wouldn't have Maison de Verre if that wasn't the case, right? I'm sure it's very cold with single pane glass and glass block and so on in cold Parisian winters. Now, all of that said, that is not what you described, does not describe the world of architecture that I belong to for over 40 years and practiced in, that I teach, that my students want to belong to, nor even any of the architects that I think of day in, day out that make life worth living, not only because their projects are addressing intractable problems like climate change and migration issues, and affordable housing, I can go on, but because they're aesthetically jaw-droppingly amazing. And so I'm not plugging this as a book. I just want to put this out here. It's let's see if I can get it. There you go. It's
Little
it's
blurred.
very, let's see, Building Practice.
Yeah.
It is a book called Building Practice. I couldn't even tell you who the authors are. It represents 40 up and coming Gen Z or millennial architects. None of them put aesthetics first. None of them put building performance first, or data first, or AI first. They are addressing building problems. They're addressing world problems. They're addressing things. And thank you for the link in the chat. That's fantastic. In real time. They are addressing issues, concerns that people have. And it's a beautiful world that is described, and they're not in cahoots with each other. It's not like there was a conference where these were, again, cherry picked to be with each other. No, these are just smaller practices that are struggling, but at the same time have hope, and they're creating hope in the work that they do and how they work with people and each other. So I guess I would just go so far as to say that there's no question in my mind that I have a real concern about um, the legacy firms that are out there, whether they are firms in the architecture top 300, where revenue is really what makes the firm the top firm. You can watch over time how some firms will always remain in the top 1, 2, or 3 positions, but below that, they're always changing positions. So revenue isn't necessarily a good way of looking at the success of an organization. Um, I do not believe that any architect today really puts aesthetics ahead of everything else. I mean, I'll just go on the record to say that. I believe that architects that want to build are working with the International Building Code and the Energy Code, and they have to find a way. So when the Energy Code, for example, says that only 30% of your building could be glass, we as a designer, that sounds like fingers on a chalkboard, right? That's like, wow, that's going to be punched openings and that's going to look awful. But a good creative architect will reinterpret that and say, what's the equivalent to 30% glass? What trade-offs can I legitimately make to make this building beautiful, but also perform well? So it addresses not only the current people who will be using it, the neighbors, but also future generations. I have full faith that we will do the right thing. And yes, that includes aesthetics. When I teach building performance classes, like the entire sophomore class, 140 students every semester, I give them the list of the top 10 things they need to be focused on, and I put aesthetics last because it's a building performance class. But aesthetics is still there. And then I leave and walk across campus and teach a design studio where aesthetics is first. Even in building performance studio, it's got to be first because we need to build these design muscles. There are a number of people on X, formerly Twitter, who all day long will tell you that architecture is not an art or art form. Shame on us for even using the words interchangeably. The reality is that we need for it to be art. We need for it to, give us hope and to be a beautiful thing that we live as a backdrop of our cities. I'm looking at the city skyline out my window right now of Chicago, and it gives me hope because while it evolved over time, nobody was in cahoots in organizing these buildings in this exact order. It's one of the most extraordinary creations of human beings. And not all the buildings were created by architects, but everything works together. I think art, aesthetics is an integral part of architecture, but I do not think it needs to be something separate from building performance.
No, I'm not saying it should be, but and maybe you have a slightly different perspective from working in practice and talking about performance issues in with students. But I guess from way back when I've been teaching at a number of fairly progressive design institutions, from Columbia to the AA and God knows where else, that where it's not really part of the agenda in terms of the design studio, and it's really, and I guess, I'm always impressed by people like Aki Menges who really see, that it's about performance of things. I guess going back to that kind of question of the this conference I was at, there was one presentation that was about bio-inspired design, and there was someone presenting some chairs that looked like they were leaves or something. And I thought, well, to my mind, that's not really what it should be about. If you want to make things efficient, design itself could make that efficient, and that is what's been environmental, not producing forms that look like they come out of the world of biology and so on. No, but I guess, I mean, of course, you get many architecture is many things for all sorts of people. But I don't know.
I'll just jump in. Well, Neil, I'll just jump in right here and say, so another caveat is I tell my students this as well in professional practice that so emerging professionals, when I'm mentoring them, I tell them if you want to just do pure design, and if you want to not make your life about all these other things, I believe strongly that 10% of all architecture firms, maybe it's a high number, need to exist and will continue to exist and will come out of these programs you're describing. And it will be its own bubble, and it's necessary. And we ought to have that. I think it's a good thing, and it challenges everybody else to, to rise to their level. But the world is not going to exist. Architects will exist, but the world will not exist if the other 90% don't address sea level rising and climate and affordable housing and migration and all the other problems that we have in the world. So architecture needs to do many things. You have a choice. You can live in that world. And I'm not saying this in any disparaging or negative way. I think it's like I said, it's very legitimate. So just to make peace with it, I think it's a real thing, and I think it needs to be there, but I don't think it represents, and it's not because I'm a professional architect. I teach design, I paint every day of my life, which is just pure aesthetics. There's nothing, it's not improving the world in any way. So I'm a firm believer in creating, if not beautiful things, and putting art out in the world. So I think it's an important thing. And I do think we've evolved as human beings, and we need art, and we need poetry, and we need music as much as we need food and shelter. I don't think I don't believe Maslow even knew when he had passed away that there was this thing called a pyramid or hierarchy. I think that was created after he passed away. And similarly, I do not believe that we need to put these things, if not on a pedestal, to keep them as something separate. It's something that needs to be part and parcel of everything we do.
Maybe I could just pick up on something we mentioned at the very beginning of your kind of collaborations going on in the field of AI, a kind of think tank, research, experimental ideas. And what, I mean, I guess I always kind of say to my whenever I talk about these things, is what we need to design right now is not a building, but the future of the profession itself and how it's going to operate. How do you see, from your experience and the discussions at the beginning about AI, how that is, where that's going to take us in terms of how we will operate in the future?
Sure. So you know better than anybody, as a full-time academic, I'm not paid to look in a crystal ball and anticipate the future. Now, that said, based on talking to a lot of people and having lots of touch points, and even watching your videos and reading your books and having conversations like this, the Q&A, by the way, so listening to myself speak when I do keynotes or presentations, forget that. It's the Q&A afterwards, the question and answer, right? The conversations where I really understand where the world is going. And when you pick up on all this, I do firmly believe that we can predict 3 to 5, maybe 10 years out, but no more. And in these groups, it's not that we're trying to predict the future, we're trying to shape the future. And that's why we have C-level or leaders of organizations and universities, firms large and small. The Built Environment Futures Council is by design incredibly diverse. The youngest person in it, I believe, is less than half my age. So it's diverse, heavily represented by different types. It's multidisciplinary, which is incredibly important, because even in academia, you can make lip service to collaboration and being transdisciplinary. But when it really comes time for tenure, you get dinged for collaborating because they don't know who actually did what. So a group like this, I think, is really important because we address multiple fronts all at the same time. And this is where we all come together and say, we already have, a capability as designers, we're wasting our time in Midjourney or DALL-E or Stable Diffusion coming up with these images. It's embarrassing in some ways because this is something we already did really well. So yeah, continue to mess with it, continue to play with it, but this isn't really how we should be focused with our time. That would be, I'm not going to speak for everybody. The Built Environment Futures Council meeting now for the second year in February is 15 individuals from many different backgrounds. And I would say that's a fair assessment right there. Real quickly, I would also say there's a philanthropic arm. So we're talking to venture capitalists and private equity firms all day long in the hopes of funding others who have these nascent ideas for where things should go. It's not to say we know exactly where things are headed, and we want to fund them. Whether with fast grants or expedited grants, so they're not spending all their time taking courses in grant writing. They get the funding. It's not going to be $1 million, but it's enough for them to show their parents, look, someone believes in me. Can I have 6 more months of living in your garage in following my dreams? So there's that arm of it. There's also another arm of it where we're in search of funding for bringing people together. Not in kumbaya sitting around, a campfire, but this idea where like-minded individuals could come together and we could start to talk about what this vision is. So I and others within that group, within the design and construction, other organizations that I am starting or belong to, whether they're academic or professional. I guess I just, the AI Institute that I'm working with, Mani Gopal-Fard at the University of Illinois, and we're working with Carnegie Mellon and other universities towards a common goal. I want to say that our vision really is working with, not against, not being fearful of working with AI. It's a very positive outlook, and it's not one that's blind, us against them. One of our workshops for the Institute for construction had over 300 individuals, working in Miro, so yes, working with Post-it notes, shame on us, but, really trying to come together. How can we affect things? So it's a roundabout way of saying it's a work in progress. I could sit here and tell you what I think, but I also think as a group, it's positive, it's optimistic. There's nothing negative or fearful about it. We'll even address things like copyright and intellectual property, right? You're a chief technology officer of a major contractor. I'm here to tell you that intellectual property and copyright is very much a concern. I'm also here to say one of the things we discuss is the fact that no individual firm, and that includes Gensler or Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in terms of a size of a firm, has enough data really to have an impact on AI. So we need to pull the data, and then there become very common concerns and very real concerns that if 5 large firms came together and created a data lake that they all pull from, is there a concern that all their work will start looking or performing similarly? And, would the Supreme Court in the United States get involved at that point because they're in cahoots with each other and forming some kind of, blockage against other firms and so on? So these are things that we concern ourselves with and discuss at length, and no conclusions.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. These things are hugely important. I just wanted to go back on one thing, which is to say, I'm criticizing image making, right? But every day I'm kind of experimenting and trying to see what I can do with these technologies. And one of the things that I find, that is really remarkable and shouldn't be overlooked is the degree that what are called these large language models, the GPT behind ChatGPT and so on, are developing these extraordinary skills we never predicted. I mean, this is the thing that is a little bit scary in some senses. We didn't teach it how to translate languages. We didn't teach how to write code. These things can do this, and what I've begun to realize is that they're also able to kind of, as Yuval Harari puts, they've hacked the operating system of human beings. They've learned how to write in some senses. It's a kind of semblance of writing, but nonetheless, it's kind of getting somewhere, it would seem. Now, I also think that they've learned how to kind of design in a loose way. I mean, it's design with staircases going all over the place. I mean, there are some things that just don't work, but there are some kind of compositional logics they seem to have taken on board, and that, to my mind, is something that is amazing and promising, but also a little bit scary. Could it really, in the end, be able to, given it's got all this data, and one of the interesting things about these large language models is they're not computationally very advanced. They don't have that much code. It's just the size of the data, the enormous amount of data that allow them to produce these what they call emergent capabilities. It's what allows them to do all these strange things, unpredictable, they were not able to do. The question I've always had, and I put this to Wan Yu recently as well, will they be able to suss out, if they can understand how code works, will they not be able to understand how building codes, how construction codes, all these things will operate, and they will be able to work with them. And one of the interesting one of the Wan Yu's response is to say, well, yes, it's easier to work with language because language is very forgiving. Working with three-dimensional form is not so forgiving. And you can, when you think about it, well, there are only what, 26 letters in the alphabet, you can't go too far wrong, but any vector can go all over the place. And I can understand that that is the real challenge, but potentially one could imagine in the future of a system, be able to understand all kinds of systems, and
Sure.
something to come out of that.
Yeah. So a couple of things on that real quickly. So one is if you have a high rise with structure all laid out and you want to do a redundancy look at removing each structural member one at a time to see where the building would fail, and then you have to create redundancy there and so on. If you asked any AI tool today, 2024, first quarter, it will hedge. Its responses are constantly, equivocating, kind of walking around. It doesn't want the responsibility. It doesn't have errors and omissions. It knows that lives will be at stake. It's leaving it to the professionals. Will that change in time? Sure. But what won't change in time is something that I saw in the first quarter 5 years ago in 2019. And that is, I'm using this as an analogy, but I was in Australia speaking, and I started meeting with a lot of startup founders, and in the first quarter of 2019, almost everybody in the startup world in the AEC industry was gearing their tools and software towards owners. By the second quarter of that year, 100% of them were geared towards design professionals, towards architects. They moved away. They were right to look at the deep pockets of owners, right? The ones who can actually buy the tools and use them. But owners didn't want anything to do with it. It was almost embarrassing in a way. So it really quickly went back to designers, and it's been with designers ever since, right? Owners don't want the liability. They don't really, if they wanted to go to architecture school, they'd go to architecture school and so on. That's a generalization, but that was my read on what happened in a really short period of time, a 3-month time period about 5 years ago. And that's before the pandemic, of course. So let's just start right there real quickly. Now I'd like to use another analogy. And that is, I heard in Brazil in 2016 speak. We brought her to our university. She's the managing principal of Thornton Tomasetti, responsible for all their built work, but 8 high-rises in particular at that time. And I asked her about the redundancy test and how they do that at Thornton Tomasetti. She explained it, and it sounded like it took between 1.5 and 3.5 days at that time, a decade ago, for them to go through that. So without belaboring this anecdote, at that exact same time, I flew to New York the week before and had met with Jonathan Schumacher at the time, who headed up TT Core, 19 people who at that time were 100% overhead, sitting in the corner of the office. Since it dispersed and became 50% overhead, and Jonathan left. But at that time, what he said is he came up with a computational tool in a matter of 13 minutes to 30 minutes, somewhere in that time period, can do the exact same thing. So I brought that to Brazil's attention, and she was familiar with the fact that her company had that tool and didn't have really a legitimate answer other than the very human one that has to do with trust. And it's, to me, it's the same hedge that our AI tools are coming up with when it comes to something as serious as holding a high rise up and saving human lives. It takes us, even if the tool is foolproof and you can prove that this computational tool can do in 13 minutes what it takes 3.5 days for the rest of the firm to do, why isn't the firm using the computational tool? And it really just comes down to trust. It comes down to, can we trust this tool? We were raised a certain way. We were trained and educated a certain way. Can we really incorporate this? So I think the tools are going to be able to fairly quickly to vet out codes, and we have up codes already, right? So we're capable, the Reynolds brothers are capable of doing, a lot of things that humans, claim to be the only ones to be able to do. So I think we have the answer that the tools will be able to do it. We need to, as human beings, as design professionals, need to catch up. There will be, again, this opportunity, like Robin Hansen's book, The Age of M, for people to work directly with the tools where they have intestinal fortitude or the stomach, in other words, to deal directly with the AIs. And the rest of us are just going to have to deal with the human foibles and the fact that we're going to need to double check all our math and make sure that whatever AI spits out actually works. So we're going to use AI as a sounding board. We're going to use it as a place to start at the beginning, bounce ideas off of, to give us that gestalt, the big, the zooming out and the zooming in. It's going to do all of that. But at the end of the day, 90% of us are going to remain responsible for the outcomes.
That's very, very interesting. The question I want to just put to you, Randy, is yes now, but how will that notion of trust and the reliance on technology begin to sort of shift over time? The reason I ask this, I mean, we're all familiar with these kind of automated systems that drive you crazy, right? And I find myself saying, "Can I speak to an operator, please?" Because I'm not getting a result out of it at all, And I think that goes back to that question of trust. You just want to have someone to understand what's going on, and that in some ways that's because those automated systems are just not refined enough yet. And if you think about it, there are some things that we totally trust. I mean, we go to an ATM and take money out and cash out, and I mean, or whatever, deposit a check, and we trust those because they're reliable. And maybe would there be a time when the trust level gets sufficiently high, our trust in the technology, that we eventually subscribe to it? And if you think about it, there are already things that we do that we wouldn't do without. I mean, we wouldn't try and calculate, do a mathematical calculation without a calculator. We wouldn't, personally, I wouldn't try and write text without spell check. And it seems to me that ultimately is really what AI is going to be about in the end. It's going to be a rather unglamorous world of spell check writ large. It's probably going to be, when we write something, it's going to be fact checking, say you can't say that, no, you're wrong there, or something. Do you think that over time that trust ratio will begin to sort of adapt?
Yeah. So, yeah, I remember when I was reading originally about your idea of technology as being this prosthetic, or AI as being this prosthetic, and I was thinking back to the 1970s with Texas Instruments and how we in middle school, couldn't do math without, or even science without our handy calculators. And that became an extension of ourselves. And we just trusted the outcomes. But starting in third grade, what did every teacher say? They wanted to see your work, right? So use the, trust but verify, right? So number one, there's that, trust but verify. It's not very sexy, not very exciting, but you knew getting me on digital futures, it wasn't going to be sexy. So number one, trust but verify. So I think we need to check our work. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, you are counting those $20 bills from the ATM. And in the event that you are short a $20 bill, you're going to go to the manager, and the manager is going to have much more faith in the machine than you are. And there's that. So where I'm going with this is I'm not just talking at length about people living paycheck to paycheck. I think the answer to the question is what's at stake. If what's at stake is a high rise falling down, I don't mean falling down because the structure isn't strong enough, but I think it's, like falling down like the Citicorp building in the event of a hurricane situation. if it wasn't designed to be strong in a certain direction due to gale force winds, yes, we ought to double check it. So I think we will trust AI, and I think AI readily soon is going to incorporate all these things. I have no doubt about that. But I also think when you have a mixologist, so in other words, you go to a bar and you've got a robot making drinks for you, if it messes up on your favorite drink, what's really at stake, right? So I think on these bigger ticket items, which is the very definition of why you go into a profession, whether it's law, medicine, or architecture, I think there is a lot at stake. Maybe not aesthetically, right? Because even a contractor can make a substitution and read into things, and you go crying to the owner saying, I was supposed to represent your, design intent, and look what happened. Hopefully you can sway the owner to have it removed and go back to the original vision, but maybe not. Still, not a lot is at stake. So I think there's going to be a whole industry. We talk about losing jobs to AI. I think there's going to be a groundswell or an industry made up of trying to determine what are the really important decisions that need to be made. And maybe this falls under the camp of regulation, and shame on us for forcing the hand of government needing to regulate more, because to the extent that we have a free market, the more creativity we'll have, the better impact we'll have on in the larger world, whether you were talking about digital cities. I think computational urban design and computational landscape is ingenious. And I think to whatever extent we can leverage these things in those worlds, I think we can actually improve things. Just look at Snøhetta just to pick one real quick example. It's a landscape solution, much like Maya Lin's wave field design that she did at U Michigan and also at Storm King in upstate New York. Snøhetta came up with a solution for an existing or new laboratory building that was built too close to a highway. And I think the client just expected Snøhetta to design a very attractive wall to keep the vibrations away, and credit them for not coming up with even one scheme that represented a wall. All of them were wave fields, and they used the computational files to actually drive the bulldozers that actually built the wave field. And then the wave field was a place for the laboratory workers and scientists to go out at lunch and walk amongst. It became a place where water was collected in the event of melting snow or large rains. I can go on and on. It was a beautiful thing to look at. So it was a win-win-win-win-win. So I think, to the extent that we're free to leverage technology to solve our intractable problems, the better off we'll be, free of regulation, as much as possible.
Andy, I've got two more questions, but I just want to mention in the chat, if anyone's got any questions, send them in. I know you've got a fan club out there. I know many of them myself. But I want to my first question is, one of the things we're going to be looking at in a few weeks' time is a question about AI and education, which seems to me the really challenging area, right? Because practice is in some ways very nimble and changes very, very quickly to things. And academia can be stuck in a rut sometimes and keeps on doing the same kind of thing. And yet this is where the crisis is going to happen, because we are preparing our students to be out there in a world totally dominated by AI. And it's a challenge. I think the battleground in the field, I think, is education, or at least should be that. And I'm surprised that it's not really the AI has not been addressed in education as much as it is in other areas. I've been blown away by construction companies. They're the ones who are taking it most seriously. And surprisingly, the least seriously, I think, has been academia from my experience. But I just wonder how you think education will be forced to adapt to this world in which AI has come in, and where, let's say, AI is able to generate designs, AI is able to answer questions that previously only the professor could answer, and so on and so on and so on. How do you think education will be forced to adapt this absolutely different landscape that is being foisted upon us?
Sure. So yes, you and I may travel in completely different circles. I mean, maybe if it's a Venn diagram, the one I don't know for a fact, but for many summers I would teach or lead a day-long course at Harvard GSD. But short of that, I probably haven't touched most of the schools that you have. I've lectured at Manchester, but that's about the extent of it. Okay, where I'm going with this is I am pleasantly surprised. So yesterday, we had our kickoff of a 2-year advisory group called the AIA HEAT, which is a higher education advisory team. And we advised the AIA on what's going on with AI. I thought they selected me, where it was a little competition or you had to apply to belong to this advisory and influence the future direction of academia. I thought they picked me as a token gesture because they wanted one person on this team representing AI. The majority were focused in AI. I am here to say I am pleasantly surprised every time I talk with academics. Nobody is being forced to look at AI. And this goes for directors of architecture schools, it goes for deans of fine and applied arts or engineering programs. So, yes, contractors historically have been ahead of everybody else because they have the wherewithal and because they find ways to cash in on it. Bless their hearts. Architects historically, yes, were kicking and screaming, whether it was adapting CAD or adapting BIM. But I think on the AI front, I see schools running with it. I do have very legitimate concerns with undergraduate students. Okay, the first 4 years of school, depending on whatever your program is, if it's a 5-year program, still the first 4 years. But it's no more concern than Google. So the same students that were checking their work on a multiple choice exam that they were taking in Google, that we had evidence that they're checking their answers against it, they're now checking it with GPT or whatever. So any LMN. So there, that just shows a lack of maturity and having the wherewithal and recognizing that that is the wrong thing to do. Graduate students should be running with AI. My students are hungry for this stuff, the graduate students. The 50 students I have in design and construction futures, yesterday, 2 weeks early, a student handed in a convergence report on combining drones and BIM. And I'm just like pinching myself, on a Friday night receiving this report. And it's not something they're writing begrudgingly. They're really excited about entering a field where all this stuff happens. So they are looking for ways to leverage AI. I think I'm the sage on the stage, teaching a graduate course or teaching undergrads and going to explain to them, the various uses of AI. And the students are way ahead of me, whether they're doing it on their own or not. There's a groundswell. So I do not think schools are forcing anyone from above, a top-down approach. I think there's a groundswell where the administrators and leaders are recognizing that students are already adept at it. Now, yes, some of them are looking from a governance standpoint. Some of them are looking from, yes, from an intellectual property standpoint or a plagiarism standpoint. They're trying to come up with rules. But again, that's the regulation approach to these things. I think we should be looking at it also from a creativity and a career enhancing and extending standpoint. We need to be working with these things.
No, I think the students are fine on the whole. I guess it's more your academic colleagues, and in some sense, okay, what I say here. But I guess I was being interviewed by somebody in Italy last week, and she was in Rome and was telling her professors were saying, no, don't engage with this. It's all about go back to history and whatever else, and which I thought was ironic because I used to work on Alberti years ago, and I always thought that Alberti was a revolutionary. I thought Brunelleschi was a revolutionary. Alberti was a revolutionary. They gave us perspective. Alberti was one of the first people to really push the Italian language as a kind of bona fide academic language, as opposed to a kitchen language, and so on and so on and so on. So I see the history as a kind of history of revolutions.
That was your first. That was your first work, right? I mean, yeah, I remember. No, I remember that, and I actually. We must be similar in age, but for whatever reason, the book that really influenced me when I first started off was Thinking Architecture. Right after that, I think you collected a lot of these different ideas and directions, the way things were going. All of that had a huge influence on me. So kudos to you for starting with a really strong foundation right where you should be, and then, and then going in your various directions after that.
Yeah, no, so, and of course the irony, of course, is Alberti's name begins with A and ends in I, which is something I'll put in my next book. But I think in some ways that so I always see him as and also frankly Joseph Rickford, who I did the translation for. I always see him as revolutionary. Some people see him as a conservative figure, but anyway, I just think that it's the students are kind of the good students are really thinking about how they can operate in this. So my best ever graduate from FIU has got a kind of an online metaverse conference center where he's hosting medical conferences and God knows what else, and designing online showrooms for cars and so on. And that, to my mind, is really how that architectural imagination should be working. It should be really thinking through these things, not in terms of of its systems and thinking about systems. I guess for me, though, that the real challenge is not just also that the kind of the view from Italy kind of thing that worries me a little bit, but I mean, the challenge also comes from a kind of logistical thing about I do a big lecture course. It's all pre-packaged online and so on, but it's about 150 students, something like that, and I this last year I thought I can't ask anyone to write an essay because they will go to ChatGPT and get write it.
See, I actually require my students to write the first draft in GPT.
Exactly. No. So what I say to them, I say, listen, I want you to use as much AI as possible.
Good.
And to use videos and things, and to really package it together, which they sometimes they come up with the most remarkable results. Although one thing I would say is that I think that ChatGPT has programmed into it some kind of safeguards, which are little bit conservative, a little bit. If you go to ChatGPT, you ask it something, it'll give you a kind of vanilla answer. Then you push it a little bit further and say, "Come on, ChatGPT, tell me what you really think," and then you get it kind of coming out. But what I discovered was with my students was I was saying, okay, and I gave them a whole series of these prepackaged sort of TED Talk like lectures to listen to, but then when it came to it, the final submission, they went to ChatGPT and said, and they got the ChatGPT answer, which was very tedious in some sense because they want the same thing. And one of the things it said, which I thought was really it goes against what I would have said. It said, "Oh, well, the thing is that humans, that AI's got no emotions, and we need human emotions, and so on and so on." And I got all these kind of presentations about that. But then I got two girls who were absolutely amazing. They had a conversation among themselves, and they said, "Well, our concern is the opposite, that AI will be able to simulate emotions. And what we're going to get is people are having relationships with their AI, with their apps and things, and probably also with robotic sex toys and God knows what else. And that could spell the end."
Well, AI is also a pleaser, right? So it knows what you want to hear. And it's a form of hallucination in that it's going to tell you that, you should play up emotions and so on. So I actually think it builds our again, trust but verify muscles when we read what AI spits out. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but
no. I just think that this is something that we need to really continue to reflect upon how we use these tools, or how we set challenges for our students to do these things. I mean, just one aside, actually, I'm going to say one of the interesting answers that I got from one of my students, and he would it was before ChatGPT, it was some other chatbot, and but quite a good one. And he said, "How do we solve our environmental crisis?" And the answer was, "Well, let's face it, human beings are the problem behind all this. So if we eradicate human beings, we've solved the crisis," which I thought was a great response. Randy, we've got a couple of comments here in the chat. One from a guy called Ren Reinfil. Okay, how do we prepare practice to accept these students using or ready to use AI? How do we prepare? Okay, I don't know if you can see that in the chat. How do we prepare practice to accept these students using or ready to use AI? I don't know whether we need to prepare practice or anything.
No, I don't think you need to prepare practice. I think, like you were saying a few moments ago, that practice is more flexible and nimble and willing, after November 2022, when GPT was first introduced to the world, Aurélie de Boissat and I, prior to that, had reached out to 300 firms and educators, and nobody was really looking at AI prior to November 2022. But from that moment forward, firms and practices were pretty much all over it. I don't have concerns there. I think we need to not just, so we have our career expo at our school next week with 85 firms coming. So irrespective of what people think of the economy, that's a pretty good turnout. And I think we need to recognize that some firms are, you bring up AI or you bring up BIM, you bring up Revit, you bring up CAD. Some firms won't recognize any of those, and that's just not in their DNA, and that's not the way they think. I think we're not just being interviewed by these firms, but we need to proactively interview the firm and understand, are they going to, so on the Code of Ethics in the American Institute of Architects, if a firm belongs to the AIA, they have to follow the Code of Ethics. And every practitioner that hires an emerging professional, a student for an internship, or a recent graduate needs to advance their career in some way and cannot hold them back. And usually that we solve that ethical issue by sending them to a conference once a year or getting them an AIA membership or something. But I think now we need to up the ante and actually, if they want to be exposed to AI, knock yourself out. It's not an unlimited budget, but maybe $20 a month. So you can, to pay to OpenAI or to, Genesis or whomever. And then beyond that, let them mess around with the tools on the side, as long as they deliver what you ask them to deliver, find a way to integrate it into the firm.
I will just simply say from my perspective back in Cambridge, when computers first started coming out, this is late 80s, right? The early 90s, there were some professors who said, no, you're not using this, which is kind of interesting because the bad students didn't use it. The good students did, and kind of disguised the fact they were using it.
But as you wrote in Architecture in the Age of AI, you even said, yeah, everything starts off that way with a sort of backlash or, stay away. And then eventually everybody comes around, right? Once you have that perspective, there's going to be professors and firms who turn their back to it. And then at some point, if they want to survive, they're going to have to find a way to incorporate it.
Yeah. So we got this question from Ashik Vaskor Manam, who is in Bangladesh, by the way. Your audience is all over the world. Are there any ethical implications or considerations unique to the integration of AI in architectural design, particularly concerning issues like cultural sensitivity, environmental sustainability, social equity?
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's posed for me, but I'll just respond right away. Absolutely. I think because algorithms and AI is based on data, we can't control what it was trained on. It's trained on human beings. That's a combination of ethical human beings and the unethical. Again, this idea of trust but verify, we're still responsible that making sure that whatever design, let's say it's for a plaza in front of a high rise, maybe you as a building developer or an architect who works with the developer recommend a setback for your high rise in exchange for the developer getting 10 extra stories of height. But will that cast a shadow on the playground? Will that introduce a more expensive building with a certain clientele? And now you have, instead of the sandwich shop where people can buy a sandwich, and any human being in this urban area can sit in the plaza, enjoy the plaza. Now it's become exclusive because, the rent has gone up or the eyes have gotten bigger, the developer for whatever reason. And now it's a 4 or 5-star Michelin restaurant. And certain people are not going to feel comfortable in the plaza. I can keep going on and on. We know that AI, along with any of our other tools, are just giving one instance. Sometimes it's the best one that takes a lot of things into consideration, but we need to ultimately look at it and see whether we're being equitable, socially equitable, racially equitable, whether it works for everybody. Moving forward, this is not on the bottom of our list, it's the top of our list. And that goes from a climate change standpoint and so on as well. I think that's incredibly important.
Oh, we got one more just coming here. In the context of AI, what are the forward-thinking government programs, state or federal, that invest in the architectural profession? Is industry leading the way, or is it a combination of engineering science initiatives? Yeah, I mean, I would, well, I mean, Brandy, you want to answer that?
Well, it's a little hard to say, but National Science Foundation and NIH, because what we deal with in architecture actually touches on health and well-being, healthcare architecture, sometimes literally. But even the example I just mentioned a moment ago in designing a public square or public plaza, you are working with public health in one capacity or another. If your organization has an R&D group, research and development, if you hire PhDs, you can easily leverage these governmental grants and programs to work in your favor, to help support research along those lines. And then the built examples become just that. They become the outputs of that research, and then you have a whole fantastic story at that point. But that said, I also think architects work independently of these programs. But I'm finding the deepest pockets being the ones I had mentioned a moment ago. There's lots of other grants. I mentioned quick grants or, that are expedited grants in these different programs that are out there. They're not necessarily governmentally based. They're private equity or venture capital based. But those are also, I think, important sources. And then there's also others that are out there that have much, they're sort of in between the fast grants and these major multi-million-dollar grants that we can go for. They're not always related to the state or to the Fed, which will have certain rules and things you've got to follow. And sometimes you have to have academics on your team.
The final question I was going to ask you, you've answered already in some senses, but I mean, let me just ask anyway. But as from your privileged viewpoint, which I think is a really interesting one, on this kind of fence between the practice world and academia, what advice would you give to the student of today or tomorrow about how to proceed?
Yeah, I would be very nimble, open-minded, flexible, not at all rigid, not at all fearful. Don't act from a place of fear. Not act, I mean, you just use the word privilege. I would never use the word privilege. I know you meant it in a kind way that I have one foot in academia and one in practice. So not privileged, not entitled, but you're given a gift, this ability to work with the world and play with the world. Who gets to do that? So I've never been bored for 1 second in my life. I just want to say as an anecdote or an aside in answering this question, in part because I was a double major in playwriting as well as architecture. So if I ever had to stand in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles for an hour, I would eavesdrop on conversations and come up with dialogue to use in a play. And then I'd go publish that or have it performed. And that kept me on my toes. And I discovered the same thing with architecture eventually. Once I studied architecture, went out in the field, your eyes dance, you're surrounded by beauty or interesting solutions or things that didn't work. And you ask yourself how you can improve upon it. Have a level of curiosity. You are wanted out in the world, primarily not for your courageousness, not for your talent even. You're wanted for your curiosity. It's much, much more important in your career and throughout time that you continue to ask questions and inquire into everything, including the great questions you've all shared in the chat and Neil has shared in this conversation. But maintaining this level of curiosity is going to maintain your level of wonder, and it's going to keep cynicism at bay. And again, in my book, Think Like an Architect, I talk about skepticism. I say architects are amiable skeptics. Those are the type that don't necessarily use skeletons or images of flames and robots, to scare people away or whatever. But I think this level of wonder and curiosity is constantly needed. I think when you interview for a job, and then I will personally, because one of my main focuses of my career has been in talent development. I constantly am talking to people who hire other people, and I want to really know what was behind a hire. Or I'll even do recruiting for major organizations you've all heard of behind the scenes. And where I'm going with this is curiosity is way up there with leadership. It's the number one or number two thing that people are looking for. So maintain your level of curiosity. Don't be discouraged, and find your niche. Find the thing that really excites you and leverage that. And you don't need to leverage it for 40 years. Nobody can predict where this is all heading. And you just need it for 3 to 5 years, as long as you keep updating that. You know, I did do a TEDx talk called The 7-Year Career. I'm a firm believer we do need to reinvent ourselves every 7 years, and not doing a pitch for it. But what I'm trying to say here is you don't need to leave architecture. You can work for Pixar Studios or whomever. I think you can stay in the field, but at the same time, have your side gig, the thing that really gets you out of bed in the morning or excited when architecture doesn't, for whatever reason, your project goes on hold or you're discouraged by something. You have something else to fall back on for a little while, and every 7 years, trade that out. That's my long-winded answer.
No, so that was perfect. I mean, a number of kind of key words that are coming out: wonder and curiosity. I think the notion of trust is something that we need to really think about a lot now. And adaptation is a fundamental part of it. And in a way, I mean, I think what we both share is an optimism in the students of the future, or in, you know, they are the ones. And I think that is that provided they show that wonder and curiosity and use it imaginatively, that's the way forward. One final anecdote: I used to teach at the University of Nottingham, not so far from Manchester, years ago, and we had one student there who was who adored Norman Foster, and he would produce reams and reams of drawings that looked like they were produced by Norman Foster. And our head of school loved Norman Foster, and he applied for a job at Norman Foster's. And actually, what's interesting, he didn't get the job, you know, because
Crazy.
Norman Foster could do that, right?
Right. Bingo. Great
What
anecdote.
what Norman Foster does, he goes round the end of the year shows, Bartlett and EA and so, and picks out the ones that have got wonder and curiosity, the things that they can do the rest. They want wonder and curiosity. I think this is a really remarkable contribution just to finish things off. This idea that is what you should sort of be focusing on. And we absorb AI. It'll be part of our world anyway. It'll be the whole landscape. We were working through AI, but we have to have that wonder and curiosity to fire things up and to move us forward. And as long as you've got that, then you're fine. Now you can't.
Yeah, and I don't want to have the final word, but I just want to piggyback on what you just said. Even when these LLMs or, you know, OpenAI's ChatGPT spits out an answer, if you maintain that level of wonder and curiosity, you will circle back and try to fine tune it, or you'll interrogate that answer and sometimes get what you're looking for. So it works even with AI. Absolutely.
Well, it does. With ChatGPT, you can have a conversation with it. And I think this conversation that we've had today has been so incredibly useful. Just one final thing. Someone's asked the question, how can they find you? I assume that you're on the website of the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. I've got to say, from a European perspective, my perception of Champaign-Urbana is probably completely wrong. I'm thinking about bubbling, sparkling wine and something in the countryside, Urbana, but it's probably not that at all. It's probably in the middle of Illinois or something, of Chicago.
Yeah. Netscape, which eventually, you know, came search engines, was invented on our campus. The LED light was invented. Yeah. So no. It's a Research One university. I don't know if it showed up, but I put my website link. You know, that's one. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
So perhaps
Thanks,
we could put this into the YouTube chat. Maybe we could put that as well.
Fantastic. And I want to thank Neil, of course, for the invitation. It was fantastic talking with you, and invite you to speak anytime. I love this conversation, maybe sometimes over coffee. Gustavo, I want to thank behind the scenes, who's really been listening in and keeping everything going. I really appreciate it.
There's a whole team. I always describe it as an iceberg. So we have Giovanna Piacca, who was kind of
Also
a poster in Peru. We have got Bavleen, who was from India, now in Miami. it is a global thing, and you've got a global audience out there. So let's continue this conversation. I think this is one of the things I got to say is you have to keep going. You have to keep stoking it. You've got to keep it alive like a fire, because things are changing, and the world of AI is changing on a daily basis, and we've got to keep attention to this thing and not get in any way complacent. But I think you've given us some gems today, Randy. Really some wonderful things. Particularly the final kind of comments about how to way forward. And let's hope that let's put our faith in the future. That in the end, let's be optimists. Let's see, it'll be quite all right in the end. Keep calm and carry on, but use your ingenuity. Be architects, because I think that is what an architect is. It's not to kind of copy the forms of certain architects and assume that that's architecture. It's to be inventive. It is a history of invention from Vitruvius to Alberti, forever onwards. It's always about being invention, about how architecture as a tradition is alive and is being fed by new ideas. It's a bit like a shark. It cannot stop. It has to keep alive. And I think this debate has been contributed. Randy been contributing to it. Randy, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much for your wisdom, and hope to talk to you again soon. We will upload this to YouTube. And just to say for everyone else, we have a series on AI Plus that's starting in a few weeks' time, where we're going to be looking at AI Plus ... including one on AI Plus education, which I think is really one of the burning issues we need to address in some detail. Thank you, Randy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.